Hey guys, I'm Ted, your host, and welcome back to our lecture series. For today's lecture, we're going to discuss slavery as it stood in the year 1840, right after the election of William Henry Harrison. And before we begin our lecture proper for today, I'd just like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on where we last left off. So in our last three lectures, we discussed the life and career of Frederick Douglass, one of the most noted abolitionists and African Americans in United States history. We also discussed the abolitionist movement itself, discussing the many different characters and the many different ways in which the movement attempted to turn popular opinion in the North and in the South against the institution of slavery. They were not entirely successful in any of their endeavors. Moral suasion, the campaign used against Southern slave owners to get them to end their participation in the practice of slavery, largely failed, and they largely failed to convince any of the Northerners to advocate for the abolition of slavery. On the national level. What they did help to add to the tensions in the Republic in the 1850s. They did turn up the political heat. And in the 1850s, as we'll see in our later lectures, the 1850s was a particularly polarizing time period for the United States. And the abolitionists helped to bring the one issue that was causing all the strife and division to the forefront. And lastly, we discussed the election of William Henry Harrison. Harrison, of course, broke the Jacksonian Democrats' back. He defeated the appointed successor of Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, in the election of 1840. And Harrison's election looked to ushering a new age in the Republic. And with that being said, let's just begin discussing slavery as it stood in 1840. Now, slavery did appear to be heading into rapidly toward the exit of the labor system prior to Nat Turner's Rebellion in the United States and abroad. The British Parliament, for example, passed an emancipation bill that freed the entire slave population of the British Caribbean. All of the slaves on the islands of Jamaica, in the Bahamian archipelago, Barbados and so forth, and Kitts, Montserrat, the Virgin Islands, all those people were freed. Also, the slave populations in what was then British Honduras, what is now Belize, the Mosquito Coast, and British Guyana. They were all freed. Prior to that, the British Parliament had banned the transatlantic slave trade, using the Royal Navy to prevent new shipments of slaves from Africa to the Americas. Now, this brought down the demand for slaves in the early Republic, and that coupled with the Northwest Ordinance, which explicitly banned slavery from the territory north of the Ohio River, in addition to Congress's ban on new importation of slaves in 1808, really seemed to herald the end of slavery. But as we saw in our previous lectures, the cotton gin, along with the rise of the British textile production, made cotton cultivation a very profitable and lucrative business. Buying slaves and establishing a cotton plantation was the primary way to enrich yourself in the middle of the early Republic. And just as this was occurring, the settlement of the Old West was beginning in earnest. So cotton was proven to be more valuable than tobacco had ever been, and really just as valuable as sugarcane harvesting had been for the West Indies, for the Caribbean islands. Cotton breathed new life into the practice of slavery. Exports rose from 12 million pounds to 588 million pounds between 1800 and 1850. And slave labor was the logical choice to turn to. Between the first federal census in 1790 and the third in 1810, the slave population actually doubled. And as we've already discussed, profits and fear were two reasons why slavery was so appealing. The fear of a slave uprising, reminiscent of the rebellion in Saint-Domingue, was terrifying to the slavocrats. The Denmark-Vesey aborted rebellion brought the fears of a slave uprising to the doorsteps of the slave owners, with a free African American aiding slaves to start an uprising. And Nat Turner's rebellion brought down the proverbial roof, with a slave planning and executing a large-scale rebellion, all in secret. Now, these events left the slave-holding South unyielding and full of anxieties on the issue of slavery. And things for them really went bad, or were really just pushed to the brink, to the limit, when in 1839, slaves, recent African captives really, aboard a Spanish slaver named La Amistad. And ironically, La Amistad means the friendship in Spanish. But the slave cargo, the slave cargo aboard La Amistad rose in rebellion while at sea and massacred all but 2 of the Spanish crew members, who were kept alive to help navigate the slaves back to West Africa. Now, the sailors did not sail. They had no intention upon sailing back to Africa because they feared they'd simply be killed once they reached Africa. Instead, they drifted aimlessly, continuing on with their voyage to the New World. And they eventually drifted into United States waters, where the ship, the slaves, and the 2 surviving Spaniards were seized. Now, the slaves, once the reality of what had happened had come to be known, the slaves were taken and put on trial. And this sent shockwaves throughout to slave owners throughout the United States. To further compound their shock and just really sort of appalled realization that there was an uprising on sea, they got an even more palsied shock when the United States Supreme Court ordered the slaves freed and returned home. This presented the slave owning elite with a terrifying vision of what could possibly happen to them at the hands of their own slaves, and that their northern countrymen, their compatriots, would be indifferent at best to their most pressing fear. Now, with the specter raised, the slavocrats turned to themselves to raise new safeguards to protect their regional economy and their peculiar social custom. Now, this is where simple racism, the simple racist arguments used previously based on color and powerlessness really begin to fade away. And the more complex racial arguments of scientific racism first begin to appear in American history and in American social customs. The Turnip Rebellion brought an end to the feasibility that slaves were content with being slaves. Now they were slaves. Now the African Americans, now they were slaves because they were the only ones in the country suited for slavery. Men like Josiah Clark Nott of Alabama made observations and conducted research that catered to this new position that African Americans were biologically suited for slavery and incapable of participating in any society as free people. To follow up on this, James Henry Hammond of South Carolina famously rationalized slavery as necessary to properly order Southern society. And on the heels of Hammond, and Nott, George Fitzhugh came onto the scene, and he argued that the enslaved workers of the South were no worse than the factory workers of the North. He exclaimed that the Negro slaves of the South are the happiest and in some sense the freest people in the world. The Northern worker is more of a slave than the Negro because he works longer, harder, and for less allowance than the Negro. The Northern worker has no holiday because the cares of life for him begins when his labor ends. He has no liberty and not a single right. And the slave owners. The slave owners were also confronted with the harsh reality that heavy cotton and tobacco cultivation wore off the soil of the slave states, leading slave owners to move further west or to sell their slaves further west. Slaves, we have to remember, slaves were a capital investment. They were expert agricultural workers. For the most part, there were some who were expert domestic servants or expert tradesmen, but the bulk of a slave owner's slave possessions would be expert agricultural workers, whose value could only be fully realized in cash crop cultivation. And if the soil became unproductive, the investment of owning slaves would lose value, and in theory, if not principle, would cause the collapse of the Southern economy, of the slave states' economy. Now, equally unlikely has the rebirth of slavery in the United States in the early to mid 1800s was the rebirth of the abolitionist movement in the 1830s. It seemed to come out of nowhere. And I really didn't touch on the beginnings of the abolitionist movement or anything like that in my lecture on it, but the abolition movement really came out of nowhere in the 1830s. And it was far different from the original abolition movement during the late colonial era and during the constitutional phase of American history. This new abolitionist movement was radical. It was militant, and it was absolute in its wish and in its determination that chattel slavery be abolished at once and forever, in an absolute manner. They were not as successful as they hoped. William Lloyd Garrison, the most outspoken firebrand of the abolitionist movement, actually scandalized his contemporaries by burning a copy of the United States Constitution. His rationale for burning a copy of the Constitution was that it was an illegal document because it supported evil. It supported the institution of slavery, therefore it was evil, and he did not respect it. Lloyd Garrison also split the American Anti-Slavery Society by trying to promote Abby Kelly, the suffragette, to the society's business committee. He even alienated evangelicals by criticizing the lukewarm reception many churches gave to abolition. Garrison attracted way more hatred from other Northerners than supporters. He also, and one of the reasons why he attracted so much hatred was that he actually had no sympathy for the working classes of the North. And the slave masters, the slave owners, for their parts, did not see any of this weakness in the abolitionist movement or the divisions. They believed and they behaved as though the entire Northern populace was presenting a united front against slavery. They believed that the entire North was united in their opposition to the institution of slavery, to the practice of owning and using slave labor. And slavery at this time was a very vibrant and thriving labor practice. In 1840, it was a economically prosperous labor system which was healthily expanding in both its geographic designation and its population. At this time, slavery had spread into the American Southwest, Texas. The Texas Republic is a slave-holding republic. The territory of Florida is a slave territory. Slavery is in Oklahoma. What is now Oklahoma, what back then would have been the Indian Territory. 3 of the 5 civilized tribes practice slave holding. Arkansas in 1836 entered the Union as a slave state. So slavery was thriving. It was expanding into different areas. It was not, at this point, there was no geographic caps on slavery. the future really seemed endless for it. And of course, when you don't pay your laborers, you receive all of the profits. So it was lucrative for the slave owners and for everyone involved in the system. And of even greater importance was that in 1840, slavery was just beginning to realize its industrial capabilities as opposed to agricultural, and was looking west, as I alluded to earlier, looking west towards the land in Mexico that could be seized and converted and used for slave-based agriculture, ensuring the future of slavery. And that's it. That's my wrap up on slavery, on the early republic slavery. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys found it informative, and I hope you guys found it a bit enlightening. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you guys thought about the lecture, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.